And let's get started. Thanks for everyone for joining today. I do recognize everyone's name in here. So I feel weird doing introduction, but I'll do it anyway for anyone watching the recording. My name is Mieko. I am the Member Services Librarian for Public Services here at CCS. And today we are going to be talking about reports for policy cleanup and staff management. So over the next hour, we're going to look at 3 web reports to answer questions around staff management, identifying circulation policies, and patron data cleanup. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be emailed to everyone who registered and will be posted in CCS News. So we're going to focus on 3 reports today. This will be the Polaris Users and Permission Groups report, the Polaris Policies report, and the Monthly Record Counts by Patron Characteristics report. So all 3 of these are web reports. I have a feeling everyone in this group is very familiar with web reports, but just in case someone who is watching is not, there is a link to the site in the agenda, and you can also find a link to the web reports on the CCS website under the Member Tools A to Z page. And to access web reports, you will log in with your L2 credentials. So that's your library email address and the Rails L2 password. So for each report, I am planning to do a brief overview with slides that will include the basic info, like where you can find the report, how often it's compiled, what type of information is in the report. And then we're actually going to leave the slides, go into the report so I can demo some methods for using it, including using simple Excel tools like searching and filtering to answer specific questions, like who at my library has permissions to do this, or what's the checkout limit for that material type. And I just want to preface this by saying, like, I'll show you how I use and search the reports, but obviously there's not one right way or method to viewing these reports. And I'm particularly thinking of that policies report here. So if you or a colleague has a different way for working with the report and that way works for you, that is great. So let's get started. Our first segment is going to look at the Polaris Users and Permission Groups Web Report, which is a report that you can use to aid with staff management at your library. So this report, it's found in the Policies section of Web Reports, which is the second to last category. And it runs daily. So the info on your users and their permissions is very much up to date. What are some of the things that you can do with this report? This report allows you to get a list of your active users. You can identify permissions assigned to a single user. You can identify permissions for a group of users. So you can see uh, at a glance all of your staff that are a particular permission group. And finally, it can help you identify what permissions you may need to add to a user. Once you download and open the web report, you'll see it's a multi-tab report. The first tab, this permissions group tab, this is where you can find a complete list of your staff users and a breakdown of what permission groups each user is in. So for example, I can see this user is in the acquisitions 1, the general staff, item editing, and the selectors permission groups. The users and last used date tab will list all of the active staff logins for your library and the date that user was last active. So I know some libraries like to do a staff audit every so often. So this tab is where you're going to find that complete list of your users. And then following these following the sets of tabs, each tab looks at the individual permission groups. Each permission group has a dedicated tab, and this is where you can see what individual permissions are in each group. So how are this structured? This tab reflects how permissions are structured on the Polaris backend tables. Um, And this is kind of like how you want to read this. So, first, you have the module, and this is the area where the action the permission is allowing you to take is located. Um, so, for those who work in the staff client a lot, the module labels might seem familiar, right? Um, the client is organized into like those modules or those marbles. And the module kind of reflects like what area in the staff client this action takes place in. Then you have the function, which is what you're doing or what you're working on, right? Are you trying to override an item limit block? Are you working on an item record or are you working on an item bulk change? And then finally, we have the permission. So this tells us what having the permission grants you. For many of these entries, you'll see that if you have this permission, the permission is allowing you to do a thing. You're allowed to override those item limit blocks, or you're allowed to do an item bulk change, or you can delete an item record, right? So that's kind of like how the individual permissions are structured in the report. So next, I'm going to open up the report and I'm going to do a demo on how to get info for a couple common staff management situations or questions. So we're going to see how to identify what permission group a user needs to be added to if they're lacking permissions, and also how to identify permissions for a group of users, with the demos being framed around these questions. So let me pop out of my slides real quick. And we are going to actually start in Leap here, if I can get there. Great. Um, so the first thing I want to do, our first scenario here is looking at like how to using the report to identify what permission group a staff member maybe needs to be added to. So we're starting off here in Leap real quick. Um, let's say I've got a staff member who's working with a patron, and they run into a permissions block. And for this example, I'm using a test user. I know they don't have permissions to reset the claim count, so that's what I'm going to use to demo. So sometimes when you are working through a permission, you might run into this permissions block. And using this message, we can then reference the report to tell us what a user is blocked from. So sometimes you see this message. This will appear in both the client and in Leap. And here, this message is going to give you the uh, function. So it's, what that action you're trying to take, and then the permission, which again is a lot of times things like allow, delete, undelete. So what we can do here is we can copy part or all of the function text or copy the permission text. And you're going to want to focus on whichever is more detailed, right? Because if we copy and search for allow, you're going to get a lot of matches. So I'm going to find some unique-ish text, right? So in this case, I'm blocked from resetting the total claim count. I'm going to copy that text and I'm going to go into my report. So let me open up my permissions report here. And earlier I mentioned we're going to use some simple Excel tools. So I'm going to use my Control F, my search function. And to locate which group this permission is in, I'm just going to paste in that function text. Now, before I hit find, I want to make sure I'm searching within the entire workbook, right? I want to search all of the tabs, not just a single tab.
Hey, Mia.
Pause here. Yeah.
Sorry, we're still viewing your browser window.
Oh, no. Okay. Thanks for the holler, and I'm sorry that was a moment of confusion there. Okay, hopefully that looks better. And I'm just going to jump into my browser and then back into the report to make sure that it
Yep, all
does.
good now.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so let me back up a moment here. So in the report, I am going to Control F to do my search function. I'm going to paste in either that function text or that permission text, remember, whichever is more detailed. And then before I hit find, I want to make sure I'm searching within the entire workbook. So that makes sure it searches all the tabs, not just a single tab. And then I can either hit find next to start going through where this permission is located, or I can click find all. There are some permissions that may be in multiple groups, specifically thinking of things like item bulk changes, right? That could be in the public services item editing group and a cataloging group. So once I launch my find, it's taking me to the general blocks override group. I can see that is exactly the text that pops up in my permissions block message. So that's my flag that this staff member needs to be added to the general blocks override group. I can open up a help desk ticket, ask to have them added. While we're in here, I just want to take a moment to give some context to this general training group. Um, if this comes up in any of your searches or your browses for the in the report, I would say don't pay attention to it. The general training group is a basically where a group where all of the permissions live, and we tend to use it for um, our training logins. If you like come to a training session and you forget your Polaris login, we have a set of training logins that you can use. They have universal permissions. Um, so that is just some context for that group. Okay, so that is one way that you are able to use the report to for some staff management, identify permission groups a user is not in. Another way that you can use this report is to identify everyone at your library who has permissions to perform a specific task. So in this example, we're going to identify who has access to the LEAP pick list, right? We just want to make sure that we've got all the appropriate staff in that group. Our first step is to identify the permission associated with that action and what group this is in. I feel like this example is pretty obvious. We have a pick list permission group, but just kind of running through. Uh, so there's a couple ways you can do this if you're not sure. The first method is to pick out a library staff member that you know can perform that action and check permissions listed in those groups to see which one the target permission is part of. Or you can browse the report for a permission, right, kind of click in and out of the tabs and just kind of see, there's a spoiler, what permissions are involved in each group. Or if you've ever used our help desk, there is a user guide on our help desk that kind of explains what each permission group does. So let's say I have a staff member that I know can access the pick list. So I'm going to use them as a reference tool. So I'm going to start off in this first tab, this permission groups tab. And again, this is where it lists all of your staff members and all of the permission groups that they are part of. So I'm going to find my staff member. Let me just scroll down here. So I've got a staff member here. They are part of 4 different permission groups. They are in the outreach group, the pick list group, their general staff group, which is just kind of like your baseline permissions, and then finally the item editing group. Um, Logically, I feel like we can identify which permission the group is in, but you can always double check that actual permission group tab to verify. So from here, it's logically in the pick list group, but just to double check, I'm going to scroll over to the pick list permission group tab. And here I can kind of see all of the permissions associated. So I can see that the pick list application, allow, pick list application, modify circulation status. Those are our relevant permissions. Now, to see a nice little view of everyone in our staff that has these permissions, I will again go back to this first tab where everyone's groups are listed. and I'm going to use the Excel filter tool to limit my users. I don't know about you, a lot of times when I'm using these reports, anytime I start adding filters, sorting, using conditional formatting, I like to delete any of those header rows. A lot of times you have merged cells in those header rows. It takes up, your data real estate. I like to just kind of get rid of those. So let's apply our filter. Under your Excel home, you'll have an area for sorting and filtering. And when you open that up, you'll see there is an option to add filters. So I'm just going to click filters. And now each column has an area where I can filter by. So in this case, we know we want to filter to a certain permission group. So I'm going to open up this permission groups filter options. All of the different permission groups are selected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck select all. And that way I can select only the permission group or groups I want to see. Then when you click OK, it'll filter down. And so now you've got a nice little list of everyone in your library who is part of that general pick list group. Okay. So that's just a few ways to use the Polaris users and permission groups report. I'm gonna pause for any questions before we move on to the Polaris policies report, which is, in my opinion, the fun one of the group. Cool. So next, we're going to look at Polaris policies report. This is the report you will use if you want to identify or check on circulation policies, things like your loan periods, your fine codes, your checkout limits. Plus, there's some other useful database info in there. This report is also located in the policies section of web reports, and it runs daily. In addition to the circ policies I just mentioned, this report also includes lists of key table values and their database codes. Um, it also includes your notice text. So if you ever ask yourself, what does our email hold notice say? You can view that text in this report. So this is a large report. It's another multi-tab. There are lots of tabs in this report. And each tab contains data from a different policy or setting table. Oop, there we go. Within each tab, you can see your library's table information. So in this screenshot, I have the dates closed table open for Morton Grove. So in here you can check your close dates. So if you're ever wondering, like, hey, did we submit our Staff Institute day as a close day? You can check that here. Some tables, like the shelf locations, item stat codes, material type, patron codes, uh, some tables also include the database ID number. So if you ever do SQL searches in Leap or the client, or you're working with a vendor to set up a new service, those searches will you'll need codes to use with those SQL searches, or the vendor may ask you for the code ID, the numerical code value for something like your shelf locations. So if you're ever in a situation where you need those ID numbers, check the policy report. For other tabs, like loan periods or fine codes, this is where you can check your library's values. So how your library defines each code. And this is where we're going to focus our demos on today. So again, got some use scenarios that I'm going to demo framed around these questions. So I'm going to use the report to identify how loan periods are defined. We're going to identify how to find the checkout limit for a patron code and identify how to find the checkout limit for a certain material type. And I will also point out some visual flags if there are any policies that need to be cleaned up, maybe. Okay. Yep. So again, I'm going to jump over to a report here. I've got Morton Grove's report. So let's say for our first demo, we're adding a new piece of equipment to our library of things collection. And we're trying to figure out like what loan period should be assigned to it. So here we want to see how our loan periods are defined so we can select the most appropriate one to assign to these items. So in our policies report, I'm going to select the tab that covers the policy I'm focusing on. In this case, we are going to start with loan periods. So the loan period tab and the fine tab, those are structured kind of in a parallel manner. And how this is structured, um, it is organized first by your loan period description. Now, in the database, each branch has its own loan period table where every combination of loan period and patron code has a value assigned. And right now, that table is over 10,200 rows and growing for each branch. And it's growing every time a new library joins CCS. So, to make the data more digestible, the report represents the majority value as all or all other patron codes. So, for example, let me scroll down just a little bit here until I get to a more commonly used one. If we're working with an item that is a loan period of audiobook default, looking at the audiobook default loan period, we can infer that when you're checking out at Morton Grove, patron codes MGK patron, MGK juvenile, NIK patron, reciprocal patron, those codes, those users will all get a 21-day checkout when they're checking out an item with a loan period of audiobook default at Morton Grove. And then any exceptions are listed separately. So users with a patron code of MGK Outreach, they're going to get a slightly longer checkout period. They're going to get a 28-day loan if they're checking out that same item. So in terms of like visual cues for potential cleanup, when you are browsing, when you're looking through your loan period codes, if you see a patron code called out that should not have an exception value assigned, that is your flag that, hey, we need to clean these values up. So in this case, if I was Martin Grove and I was looking at this report and I said, well, MGK educational should just have the same loan period as all or all other patron codes, I can then open a help desk ticket and ask for that cleanup. Now for our demo, we're adding a new piece of equipment to our library of things collection. So here's how I want to do this. When I'm browsing for a loan period code to use, I'm going to first consider like what type of content our new item is, and generally how long do I want it to check out for the majority of our users. And then I need to ask myself, are those exceptions that are called out, are those acceptable? So let's say this particular item is a tool. We anticipate patrons will need it for longer projects, so we want to give it at least a 3-week checkout. So I will scroll through our loan periods to find the loan period description that best reflects the type of item, right? So if this is a tool, maybe device may not be the best match for it. I'll keep going. So let's say I have some equipment here, which matches our tool, and I've got the options between a long, a medium, and a short. So we said that wanted to check out generally for 3 weeks for most of our patrons. So here I can see that our equipment long, for most users, it's going to check out for 21 days. And then I want to see if we are okay with the exceptions that are called out. So if a user with a patron code of MGK Outreach or MGK Educational checks this item out, is it okay that the item goes out for 28 days or 42 days? And if that's acceptable, then we've made our choice. If not, then we can keep scrolling until we find an appropriate code. So that is a look at the loan period code or the loan period tab. For the next two examples, I want to look at checkout limits. So in your policies report, I'm just going to scroll over a couple more clicks. There are a set of tabs that cover checkout limits, scroll over a little more, and hold limits. These tabs are set up a little differently than the loan period tab. So I'm going to open up the patron checkout limits tab. Um, Again, there is a information in the header here that kind of reviews what we're going to go over right now. I do like to delete these header rows when I'm working with this tab just so I can see more of the data. So how is this tab organized? This tab is first sorted by patron code group. So the group sorts your codes based on the patron code suffix. So it strips the three-letter library code to get the group. So MGK patron will fall under the patron group. MGK educational will fall under the educational group. PRK adult is going to fall under this adult group. And then within that group, you have a number that represents the most common limit with the exceptions called out. And the exceptions tend to be more pronounced in the checkout and hold limit tabs than they do in something like the loan period tab. And there's a few major reasons for this. First, the overall checkout limit is set by the home library. So a patron code may easily have a higher or a lower limit than the most common value. Second, patron codes may be local use only and therefore have a checkout limit of 0 at your location. And you'll see these called out as exceptions. And I also want to mention that while many libraries use a standard code list of code suffixes, libraries may customize their patron code labels. So while many libraries have like XYZ patron code, some libraries decided instead to use like ABC adult, ABC juvenile. If we scroll through, you can see there's a library with a nanny au pair patron code. So while you have 6 codes that you use, uh, this list is going to represent the codes from all CCS libraries. Another thing you may see here, so I'm scrolling up to the institutional patron code group to highlight this. Every once in a while, there may be a code group that has 2 most common limit entries. This occurs when there are 2 or more equal majority values. So for example, for institutional, maybe there are 3 institutional patron codes with a checkout limit of 150 and 3 institutional patron codes that are local use only, and so they have a checkout limit of 0. And because there's 3 of each, that means there are an equal number of most common limits. So let's do our demo scenario here in this tab. Let's say we're reevaluating the max checkout limits for our teacher cards. So we want to review the current limits. The first thing you may want to do, I should say, the first thing you want to do is look at their patron code group. You want to establish which patron code group your target user is in. If you are not sure what a certain code is, or you want to, in a glance, see all of your patron codes, you should start in the patron codes tab in the policies report. So again, I'm just going to scroll through my code tabs until I get to one labeled patron codes. This lists all of the patron codes system-wide. So in here, you will just need to scroll down until you get to your library's set. So we're working with Morton Grove today. I'm going to hit the MGK group and just check out to see what those code suffixes are. So for this library, looks like we are going to assign teacher cards to a code of MGK educational. So with that, I can go back to my patron checkout limits tab, and I know to look at the patron code group of educational, right? MGK educational, the patron code group is going to be educational. And then once I get to that patron code group, um, I'll see if my patron code is called out as an exception. If not, I know that it's going to be included in the most common limit. Uh, if the otherwise, I'm going to check to see if my code is called out as an exception. And for this example, for MGK Educational, it is, so it's called out in its own row. So I can see that the overall checkout limit for this patron code is 999. And from there, I can make the decision, do I need to increase it? Do I need to decrease it? How do I want to handle this code? So going back to this institutional area, what if we were looking at the institutional group where there were two most common limits and no exceptions called out? How would we know which one is ours? Um, this one, you first want to consider the values. If one value is 150, the other value is 0, and you know you allow your institutional patron code to check out at your location, then logically you can conclude that your code has a max checkout of 150. Um, if you are not able to infer, let's say it's like it was split between maybe a limit of 300 and then a limit of 150. So if you're not able to infer your limit from the values listed here, um, you can always reach out to CCS and we can verify the values for a specific code directly in the backend tables. I'm going to pause for just a second, see if there's any questions about that loan limits tab or the patron checkout limits tab before we move on.
Hey, this is Nora from Prospect Heights. In our loan periods tab, for some reason, EVK pack reg is called out in every single thing, which seems wrong. But what
That's
I also noticed that on like the patron codes as one of the options. So what is that about?
so the EVK pack reg, Evanston chose to use a patron code for EVK pack reg for that is auto assigned to online users who register online. And then once they go in to verify their card, it's updated to like EVK patron. So if it's first of all, if it's called out in like every single loan period, that is definitely a flag for cleanup. It sounds like when that patron code was established, it was just kind of given default without being cleaned up to match the library's standards. So open help desk ticket, we can take care of that. I do not believe that code has reciprocal borrowing privileges, so you should not run into anyone with a code of EVK patron or EVK pack reg checking out at your location.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Chat, would that be the same for any patron code that isn't from our library? Um, Not necessarily. So most of these patron codes were established at during like the big migration. So we basically everything was like coded in from the beginning to have consistent loan periods. So things that were like reimagined after going live, may need some cleanup. That makes sense. And so Sarah mentioned they have some loan periods that have exceptions for some of the newer to CCS library patron codes. Um, I anything that's like Palatine, Grays Lake, Warren Newport, and they're called out as exceptions, that is just a flag that they do need to be cleaned up on the back end. So open the help desk ticket, we can get it. It takes us like maybe 20 minutes per branch to clean up. That is kind of the fun part about starting to dig into these reports as you see those fun little cleanup projects. Are you
So
ready to talk
just
about? Oh, yeah,
sorry,
Nora,
just
go
to
for it.
clarify, on the patron checkout limits, having all of those other libraries called out for different amounts is fine because that's sort of defined by that library. Okay.
You are correct. And that is actually a nice segue into the next demo, the material type checkouts limit demo. So I'm going to leave the checkout limits and we're going to move into the next tab, patron code mat type for material type checkout limits. Um, So just to kind of review the difference between patron checkout limits and patron material type checkout limits. Um, the patron's home library sets their overall checkout limit, and that value follows them system library to library. The transacting library or the checkout library sets the material type limits. So let's say your library allows no more than max 150 book item checkouts, or 5 video game hot checkouts. So that is where this is where those limits are defined. It's by the material type. So again, in here, I'm just going to delete this top, all that header information so we can see more of the data. So for demo 3, we want to review the current computer equipment checkout limits for our patron codes. So this is another very large tab. The back end table is over 14,000 rows. The report tries to condense it together as much as possible. So you see a lot of those most common limits. However, again, we have a lot of exceptions called out, and we'll get into that in a moment. So this tab is also sorted primarily by the patron code group. And then for that group, it lists each material type, and then it gives either the most common limit, or if there are exceptions, it's going to call out those patron code exceptions. If your library has very high material type checkout limits, you may see quite a few exceptions called out for the material types. And this is because the material type limit will never exceed the patron's overall checkout limit. So I'm going to drop down to the exempt patron code to kind of highlight this. Okay, here we go. And let's look at book. So Morton Grove allows up to 999 items with a material type book. However, many patron codes have an overall checkout limit lower than 999, right? Many patrons have a max checkout limit of 150. Sometimes it's going to be 200 or 50. Or if a code does not have reciprocal borrowing privileges, they will be called out with a 0 value because they are not allowed to check out at your location, right? So the material type limit will never exceed the user's max checkout limit, and that may lead to more exceptions being called out depending on your own material type limits. So for this last demo with this report, I want to use the report to identify the checkout limit for computer equipment for my patrons. So again, because this first level of sort is by patron code group, I need to identify my local patron codes, so I need to know what groups they are in. Again, you may know this off the top of your head. If not, reference that patron code tab. So again, let's go to the MGK group. So I am looking in my report, I am looking specifically at the educational, the exempt, the juvenile, the limited use, the outreach, and the patron groups. So let me go back. Now that I know that, I'm going to go back to my patron code material type checkout limits. And again, I'm going to use filters. So first thing, again, I'm going to activate my filters. So real quick, we're talking about identifying cleanup. I just want to show you real quick what that can potentially look like. So for this example, we are focusing on computer equipment material type. So I am going to apply a filter to just focus on computer equipment. And now I can see what that, what my material type checkout limit is for all patron codes. Here, when you're looking at this list, sometimes I like to remove the 0 values since those users don't have reciprocal privileges at my library. It helps just to kind of cut out that noise. And then I can kind of see what the checkout limits are. So if there is a code called out that's higher, like here I see values of 3, maybe these checkout limits of 20 are a visual flag to me if I don't allow more than 3 checkouts. I know that from my our library policies. Seeing a checkout limit higher than what I'm expecting is a flag that this might need to be cleaned up. So then again, reach out to CCS. We can verify the values on the back end and increase or decrease the values as needed. To round out this example, though, we are going to focus just on the checkout limits for our patrons. So while I have this filtered down to my target material type, I also want to filter down just to my patrons. So I'm going to first use the patron code group to limit to the MGK, those Morton Grove groups. So let me deselect everything and then apply the appropriate groups. And we said that was educational, exempt, juvenile, limited use, outreach, and the patron group. Okay. So now I've got my groups limited, but I'm still seeing a lot of those exception callouts for other libraries. So my final filter is going to limit those codes just down to my own. So how we're going to do this, I'm going to expand the patron code filter. I'm going to deselect everything. So when you're focusing just on your own patron codes, you want to select anywhere that your local codes are being called out. So as Morton Grove, I'm selecting my MGK codes. And then I'm going to select the most common limit because if my code isn't called out, I know that it's included in the most common limit. And then I'm going to say, okay, and now my list is filtered down. So from here, I can see that, patron, outreach, those each get 3 checkouts. I do have 2 entries for educational. I know that my code is called out here with a checkout limit of 3. So this one, educational, is not included in that most common limit for this one. So again, here, now that I can see what my checkout limits are, I can make that decision. Do I want to increase? Do I want to decrease, leave as is? So again, I would say like the patron checkout limits, patron material type checkout limits, those are kind of the meatiest tabs in this report. So I hope just kind of seeing running through those demos kind of helps kind of ground that report a little more. So let's finish up here uh, by glancing at one last web report, the monthly record counts by patron characteristics report. So while you can use this report to get some quick stats on your patrons, it can also be a way to identify records for cleanup. So changing it up from our other two reports, this one is located in the statistics section of web reports, and it is a monthly report, so it runs at the start of the month. So keep in mind, since it runs monthly, if you do end up doing any cleanup mid-month, the changes won't be reflected until the report runs the following month. So let me jump in. I think it's better highlighting here, looking at the actual report. I'm going to open up. So this is a non-Excel report. So when you open the report, it opens up into a new tab. And on the left-hand side, you'll see some different subdivisions available to break down your patron counts. Um, I'm going to open up the delivery option. For your monthly, or I'm sorry, for the multi-branch libraries, you will see uh, count breakdowns for some of these categories that will do it branch by branch and some that will do it for the entire library. So the library option will give you a count for entire uh, your entire pool of users. Um, or you have the option of selecting a branch if you wanted to see users registered to, maybe just your main library versus just your branch. I'm in Highland Park right now. It's a single branch library, so my counts for the branch option and the library option are going to be one and the same. Clicking on one of these sorts will give you a breakdown of patrons based on those characteristics. And this can be a breakdown of a single data point, like our delivery options, or it might like do a multi-tier breakdown, like our patron code and stat class. Within that breakdown, right, I can get a count of how many users have email notice delivery option versus a text messaging delivery option. And then within that breakdown, I can click on a link to view a list of patrons with that value. Now, this list is limited to 2,000 records in order to prevent returning a large hit list. If you're looking for a list of patrons for a very common value, like users with an email address notification, my recommendation is to use Simply Reports. But if you're using this report to identify outliers that may need to be cleaned up, right? So these are going to be entries with like a small number of patrons. This report is great for identifying those users. Okay. So for our demo prompt, I am asking what records are incorrectly coded. So we want to identify records that may need like a patron code or stat class or registered at branch cleanup. So I'm going to click on the link for patron code and statistical class. So these are all the combinations of patron code and stat class for users who are currently registered to our library. So all of these users have a registered at branch of Highland Park. And then I can see how many users have, HPK exempt or HPK patron assigned. Um, and then we can look at these combinations to see like, okay, which ones look like they don't belong to either together or belong to our library. So for example, this report is only returning users registered to your library. So there should be users registered to CPL or to reciprocal patron. So right there, that is a flag that either maybe the patron code needs to be updated or the users registered at branch needs to be updated. And then what's nice here is that I can open up a, let's see, a list. If you are viewing the recording, the patron information is going to be blurred out. So just a heads up. And I have a pop-up block. There we go. Um, so when I open up my report, I can see a brief list of these users. So I can look at, I've got their barcode. I see that patron code and stat class, and then the patron's last name. And from this, if I identify one that looks off, I can copy and paste their barcode number into Leap and clean up that record. Another way that you can use this report is to identify how you're assigning a certain patron field. So let's say we're talking about internal card procedures and checkout limits around our educational patron code, right? How are we assigning it? It's like to schools, to individual teachers. How are we applying stat codes? So for this one, I'm going to jump into just the patron code. So we see a breakdown just by code. And then I can open up my educational code and at a glance, check out my list. So I can see, um, you know, who we're assigning it to, the last name at least, right? So it looks like for here, it's a lot of institutions. And then I can see how we're organizing or how we're assigning our stat classes. So from here, I can establish, um, let's say this is a code. Yes, we want to keep using it for institutions. Let's reorganize how we are assigning our stat classes. So again, you can quickly access a list of these users, get a sense of how codes are being applied or applied together. Now, real quick, alternatives for this report. I am a huge fan of Simply Reports, especially because you can add in more output options if you wanted to see the patron's full name, their address, their contact information, or you can always use Leap as well. Let me cancel out of here. Ah, my there we go. My Zoom banner is in the way. I couldn't get to my find tool. So if I want to do the same thing in Leap, I could just search for patrons, um, by patron code, select the patron code I'm interested in, and from there I can browse that list. And if I spot something I need to clean up, I can just open it up right away and clean that record up. So again, I think this report is incredibly fun for getting a glance of your users, but also definitely wanted to point out those alternatives there. Go through. Okay, so wrapping this up, we checked out 3 web reports that will help us answer questions around staff management, around circulation policies, and some patron data cleanup. All 3 will kind of give you insights to how things are structured on the back end, and give you some visuals for potential cleanup. Um, the nice thing also when using these reports, like don't feel free to, manipulate them, add in those filters, add in conditional formatting, do the sorting. If something goes wrong, even if it's like beyond the point where you can, control Z undo, you can always re-download it again from web reports. If you are working with these reports and have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to the help desk. We love getting questions about the reports and interest in cleanup. So again, I will share a link to this recording when it's available. And we also have a training evaluation that I will share. Please fill out if you have a few moments. It does help us plan for our future training sessions. So thank you for joining me today. Thanks for dealing with the tech issues we have always because it's a webinar. And I will be sticking around in case there are any questions.